Greetings fellow members of the Esoteric Order of Gamers. Welcome to part 2 of my series on building and painting the figures from Aliens. Another glorious day in the core. And we're doing the core set of Aliens. I've already showed you how to put the figures together. In fact, I showed you how to put all the figures together from the expansions as well. But in this video, I'm going to be painting the Marine and civilian figures. So settle back, relax, or get your paints ready, whichever way you like to watch these videos and use them. I hope you find it useful. Now, before we get started, I just want to tell you what kind of a painting tutorial this is. Now, I am not a professional painter by any means. I've just been doing it for many, many years since I was a kid. And I have my own way of doing things, and it's a little bit rough and ready sometimes. I have a wet palette. This is my Red Grass Games wet palette, and I usually put my paints on it and I mix them around, and I add a bit of white to highlight, and I mix my colours together, and I go back to old colours and things like that. So it's very difficult for me to get so organised as to say this highlight colour is X or this shadow colour is Y. I know that modern ways of painting, especially with the Games Workshop system, are all about identifying every single colour. Well, I don't do it that way because I mix colours together all the time. And also, I don't want to buy all of the tiny little variations of Citadel paint. So, if I just want a lighter flesh colour, I'll add a bit of white to the flesh colour. So that's what I'm doing in these videos. I'll identify the paint colours as much as possible, but I hope after a certain point you'll get into the flow of just mixing things on your palette and adding a bit of colour till you get the right one. For example, some of the khaki colours that I wanted to use for these figures, I didn't have quite the right colour, so I mixed a little bit of dull green with a little bit of brown just to get the right colour. If you don't like this way of painting, that's fine. There are plenty of other tutorials on the web. I'm sure you can find the one that fits your style perfectly. If you do like this style, I highly recommend it because it really loosens you up and it gets you experienced in colour theory, and it's also a lot cheaper because, as I said, you don't have to buy all those variations of paint. So after that long-winded explanation, let's get into the actual painting, starting with priming the figures. Before you start painting, of course, you have to prime your miniatures. So I have a piece of board here, and I've just attached the miniatures with a piece of blue tack onto the board, and this way I can sort of move the board around easily. The important thing is, of course, is to wear a gas mask of some sort, or even just a mask. So I'm sure you've got a lot of these hanging around at the moment. Put this on your head. Give this a good shake. Just hit your miniatures with short controlled bursts from all different angles and make sure you have an even coverage over them. Now all the marine figures I'll be undercoating in white, and of course all the aliens I'll be undercoating with a black spray. Here are all the aliens undercoated in black. Just make sure you get underneath them a bit as well, so you can get underneath all the figures and make sure all the areas are well coated in black. And here's my painting area. Everything I need is all set up and ready to easily access. We've got a container of water here, a piece of paper towel to clean things on. We've got my brushes. At the moment I'm using Rosemary & Co. brushes, which are relatively well priced but still good quality. My collection of Citadel paints along there. I've got a head loop, which is good for magnifying. Wear that on my head and it makes things easier to see. I've got my Red Grass wet palette. You can see it comes with a lid there to keep it wet, and this is an essential part of your painting. Get yourself a wet palette. The ones from Red Grass are great, and I just find it absolutely essential for painting. It keeps your paints wet and it makes blending easy. It's an essential thing to have. And of course, here are the miniatures I'm painting. These are the ones from the core set, and they're already primed in white and ready to go. So everything you need is here. Of course, I've got a camera set up as well, which you won't be needing. Now, unless you want to come up with your own colour schemes, I highly recommend getting some reference first. So I downloaded all these from the Gale Force 9 website, and this gives me fantastic reference for painting these figures. I prefer to use someone else's paint jobs for these because it just makes the whole painting process faster and easier. Okay, let's rock! The first miniature we're going to paint is Ripley, of course. These are the colours I'm going to use. For a flesh colour, I've got a mixture between Kislev Flesh and Bugman's Glow. I don't have exactly the right flesh I like, so I'm going to mix those two together. Dryad Bark I'm going to use for her jacket. A mixture of Altdorf Guard Blue and Mechanicus Standard Grey will be for her the pants. Mephiston Red is for the highlights on her shoes. And finally, Deathworld Forest with a little bit of Mechanicus Standard Grey for the gun colour. So let's get started with the flesh colour. And as I said, I'm mixing these two together. So this is my first example of mixing colours together to get just the right tone that I want. I don't have to buy them all separately, I can mix them together. So I paint in Ripley's flesh colours on the face and on the arms. And straight away I make a mistake on the other arm by not painting the whole arm, just the hand. But I'll fix this up later. You'll see at the end of painting Ripley, I realise that this isn't a sleeve, it's in fact an arm. And while I'm on this flesh colour, I've got it on the palette, so I might as well do the other flesh colours of the civilian and marine figures. So I go through all the figures that have a similar skin tone and just paint them in while the colour's fresh on my palette. Now, of course, don't forget to mix a few brushfuls of water with your paint so it flows on very easily. Of course, for Frost, he's a black American character, so I'm using Dryad Bark for his skin colour. Right, back to Ripley. I'm using Altdorf Guard Blue and mixing it with a bit of grey to get the right tone for her overalls. The blue I had was just a little bit too bright and I wanted to dull that down. So to dull it down, I add a bit of grey. Again, mix some water with that. I'm always mixing water with my paints just a little bit so it flows on more easily. Never put paint really straight from the pot. You'll always find it's too thick. One of the big mistakes that novice painters make is painting on their paint too thickly. It's better to do 2 thin coats than 1 thick coat because you won't obscure the detail on the miniature. So I paint all that area in, then I get some Abaddon Black and paint her hair. Being careful to paint around the ears and just make sure I'm just getting the hair areas and none of the face. This is where my head loop is very handy because I can get good magnification. Dryad Bark is a really good brown colour, general brown colour. I'm using that for her jacket. So just straight from the tin with some water, of course. And doing this quite carefully now because it's a dark colour, so I don't want to paint over any areas that aren't brown. Oftentimes when you're painting, you can be a little bit rough if you know a darker colour is going to go over the colour you've painted and clean up any areas. But with a dark colour like this, you have to be quite neat. Mephiston Red is used for the highlights on her shoes, and it was interesting to do a little bit of research on this online and realise that the shoes she was wearing were some 1980s designed sneaker things, Nike I think they were, and they had this sort of grey, white and red pattern, quite distinctive. Probably looked very modern and sci-fi at the time. So I'm painting those according to some reference I found online, using Mechanicus Standard Grey as well, and just following the photo that I found online of her shoes. So if you actually Google Ripley's shoes, aliens, you will get a picture of these particular boot sneaker things she was wearing, and you can follow it roughly to get an idea of an accurate paint job. Deathworld Forest is the next colour. Again, I'm mixing that back into the grey that I already have on my palette to desaturate it a bit so it's not quite so bright. And that gives me a nice khaki colour for parts of the gun. And it's just a matter of mixing in colours until you get exactly the right colour that you want or that matches your reference. If your green is too saturated, mix in some grey to desaturate it. Black Templar is a great black colour because it flows, it's a contrast paint and it flows beautifully from the container and goes into all the crevices and does a little bit of an instant highlight if it's painted on white. One of the reasons I like priming in white. There are all our base colours. We're off to a good start. Now it's time to shade them. I always shade my flesh with Seraphim Sepia most of the time because it's a nice brown chestnutty kind of shadow colour to flesh colours. So I'm painting that on now. Next up is good old Agrax Earthshade, an incredibly useful wash. You will use it all the time. I'm painting that on the khaki of the gun and also on Ripley's jacket. And that gives me some lovely shades to my paint job. Aren't washes fantastic? I remember painting figures before washes existed. It was a nightmare. Drakenhof Nightshade is a nice dark blue colour, which is good to paint the jumpsuit in. I'm using that as my shade. You can see it darkens the colour quite a lot, so keep that in mind when you're putting the colours in. And of course Nuln Oil to wash the black areas of the gun. I'm also watering down Nuln Oil a little bit. You can also use Lamy and Medium to water down the ink or the wash and to wash the boots. It's time for the highlighting, and this is really where a wet palette comes into its own. You can see there I've mixed some white with the existing colour that I used for the jumpsuit pants, and I've got a nice range of lighter to darker colour there that I can just dip into and play with as I'm painting the highlights on these pants. And this is the great thing about a wet palette, because it keeps the colours wet and you have a lot of variation there on your palette to just pick the right level of highlight that you need. Now be quite confident with your highlights. Remember, it's a little miniature and you are representing light and shade on your figure, and you're exaggerating it because it's a tiny figure, it's not a human-sized figure, so you want to exaggerate that light and shade. So when you're doing those very strong highlights of the folds of the cloth, you want to make them quite contrasty highlights. Again, you can see that I've mixed a decent amount of water in, so this paint flows quite nicely, and I can keep putting it on and layering it on without obscuring any of the detail. Just carefully picking out her collar there. And of course, when it comes to things like the knees, you always want quite a bit of contrast there. That's where the knees will be straining against the fabric and you'll get a bit of a sharp contrast. There are also some lines built into this particular pant arrangement, so highlight those. And you want to highlight the bottom of the pants as well, where they meet the boot. Using some straight white, I'm going to highlight the boot areas, leaving some of the grey behind as shadow. And as you can see, I'm not being perfect about this. This again is a figure that you're going to see from a distance. You don't have to be absolutely exact about everything. It can still look a bit painterly when viewed close up, but you really are going to look at it close up. So that's starting to look good. And I've got quite a lot of complexity of shadow and highlight in there very easily. So mixing some Ashabti Bone, which is a good highlight colour for browns, I mix that with my brown instead of white, and that gives me a less chalky highlight, and start painting on the highlights. And as you can see, I'm being quite painterly here. I'm following the wrinkle lines on the figure itself, but occasionally I might paint in another one, just a freehand one, just to increase that impression of light and shade. But most of the time I'm just following the sculpted detail and highlighting areas where light would hit from above, like little edges of the lapel there or the shoulders, things like that. Again, don't be afraid to do a pretty sharp light contrast highlight. You can always tone it down later if you want to, if you feel it's too bright. But most of the time you'll find that a little bit more highlight is better than too little. You can see some pretty bold brush strokes there, and it looks good from a distance. I could blend those perfectly into the background of the jacket, but it's really not necessary. Again, more highlighting. Now I'm going to highlight the khaki areas of the gun with a very, very fine, quite contrasty highlight. And that sharp highlight gives it a more sort of sharp feel to the object. Mixing a little bit of white scar with the flesh colour that's already on my palette, I can highlight the flesh areas now. With this, you usually start with the sort of T area, which is down the nose and across the forehead, and a bit on the chin as well. And then you can move on to highlighting the tops of the cheeks, under the eyes. You can see I'd already put a couple of very small black dashes for where the eyes go. And highlighting along the cheek line is also good as well. How much you blend this into the original colour is up to you and how much effort you want to put in. But as you can see, this is pretty contrasty, but it works well from a distance. To do the lip, mix a little bit of red in with your flesh colour and just highlight the bottom lip. Don't do both lips, it'll look ridiculous. I'm putting some tiny dots in there for the eyes, very, very tiny little dots, be careful with that. But then you can go back with some black and outline the eyes a little bit or reduce the level of white that you put in and fiddle with that until it looks acceptable. You might want a little dab of white on the tip of the nose where there's the strongest highlight, perhaps a bit on the chin. If it's too much, you can always pull it back with some of the flesh colour on your palette. And of course, don't forget to highlight the arms and hands as well. Knuckles usually get a relatively white highlight. Onto the gun, I'm using grey, just a bit of white mixed with my Abaddon black, just to highlight the black areas of the gun. A bit of highlighting on the hair. I mix a little bit of a shabty bone with my brown colour to put in some little brown highlights. You just have to do something suggestive there to suggest the highlights and lift the hair a little bit. And there she is, Ripley. Pretty much done. Now we'll just do the base and we can finish this figure off. Oh, I just remembered I hadn't done that arm, so I redo that arm. Using lead belcher, I'm going to paint the base. Make sure you get the paint into all the little holes, and then when that's thoroughly dry, use Nuln oil to shadow the metallic base. To highlight that, Stormhose Silver is good. You want to dry brush this, so wipe most of your paint off on a paper towel and then brush it lightly over the raised areas, especially the nameplate, and a little bit over the rest if you want to. You don't have to. You might also want to put a bit of Agrax Earthshade into the base as well to give it a slightly oily feel. The final touch is Abaddon Black around the edges of the base. And you can see if you hold it at just the right angle, it's very easy to paint the edge in quite bold strokes. And before you know it, our first figure is done. It's time to get started on the Marines now, and these are quite challenging because they're covered in a camouflage pattern, two different camouflage patterns. So we'll start with some base colours. I'm using Baneblade Brown on the pants and the shirt. So there's the pants and the shirt, and then there's the armour. So let's paint on this base colour, and I'll be putting base colours all over the figure. Then we'll paint on the camouflage pattern, and then we'll put a wash all over everything to unify the camouflage pattern with the base colour. And hopefully it'll all work. I'm just experimenting as I go along. But yes, I found out the results are pretty good in the end. So let's put on that Baneblade Brown. You can be pretty messy with this because you'll be touching up later. Dryad Bark is the colour I'm using as the base colour for the armour. But I wanted to make it a little bit darker, so I'm adding some Abaddon Black to make it a darker brown, because if you look at the source material and you look at the original photos, you'll see that this armour that they're wearing is a very dark brown. So painting that on, remember of course always to mix water with your paints so they flow on nicely. You want to be a little bit more careful with this application because of course it's a very dark colour. And I'm putting this pretty much all over everything. I'll be picking out some of these details later in other colours, but for the moment this is just putting a nice dark colour over all of those armour areas and pouches and all that kind of stuff. and of course his helmet and his boots. And all these techniques can be applied to all the marine figures. They're all pretty similar. So I'm going to show this one. I'll show you some other ones as well, but this is the only one that I'll fully paint from scratch because I'm doing the other ones in exactly the same style. Just making those edges nice and neat. Sometimes you'll want to let the other colours dry thoroughly, of course, so you don't have any colours mixing together when you're putting on the new colour. Doing his helmet and also the chin strap as well. Make sure you don't leave any white areas. Doing his armbands. And finishing off the boots. And then a little bit of retouching where I just went over into the lighter brown area. But it doesn't have to be super clean because I'll be washing this later and that will fill in the gaps nicely with a shade colour. So here's my camouflage patterns looking at my source material, and I checked these with original photos to see if they were pretty accurate, and they are. So for the armour colour, Caliban green, Vomit brown, which is an old colour, Doombill brown, and Codex white. And these are the colours I'll be painting onto the dark armour. I'll be using Deathworld Forest and Mechanicus Standard Grey and Codex White again. And that'll be painted on the pants and shirt. Well, in this case, just the pants. So I've started putting on the colour here, and I've already put on Doombill brown, and now I'm putting on that yellow colour. And really, it's just a matter of dabbing on little bits of camouflage pattern. Again, you can look at that source material to give you an idea of how to do this. This was my first try on it, and perhaps the strokes are just a little bit thick. I think I went a bit thinner with later ones. But you've just got to experiment. It's going to look very messy to start with. At first I thought, oh, this isn't going to work. But trust me, once you've washed everything, it'll unify this quite nicely and the colours won't stand out quite as much. I tended to do everything in a sort of left to right diagonal kind of pattern. It doesn't have to be like that, but that seemed to make things hang together a little bit more. That's a bit blobby, that white bit there, but just thin lines for the white. I'm not painting the pouch for the shotgun. That's not camouflaged, or any of the ammo pouches or anything like that. Just the armour areas. And if you want to, you can go back with your dark brown and retouch it. You've got all your colours on your palette, so you can keep fiddling with it. Putting on the green, the Doombill brown. And then I'm painting the light box on his shoulder. I originally started using the Baneblade brown for this. Later on, I went back and made it a bit of a khaki colour. So yeah, I'm just mixing a bit of that green into there and making it a bit more khaki. So as you can see, experimenting as I go. I don't necessarily stick with every decision that I've got. I sometimes shake it up just a little bit. Adding some dryad bark and some shabti bone and giving myself a lighter brown to paint the shotgun pouch that he's got on his back and the other pouches that he has, just to differentiate them from the armour a bit. There he is, as you can see, looking pretty messy at this stage, and I was wondering if this is going to work, but it does in the end, trust me. So now I'm doing a camouflage pattern on the pants. I'm also using a bit of a shabti bone. That wasn't part of the original plan, but I'm using that as well. And the Codex white. Again, using that diagonal pattern. Using a bit of the dark brown as well for a bit of contrast, and there it is. Now it's time to start washing. As always, I use Seraphim Sepia for the flesh areas, so straight from the pot, putting on Seraphim Sepia to add some shade to those fleshy areas. With Doombill brown, I painted, after the wash was dry of course, I painted the stock of the shotgun, and lead belcher I used to paint the barrel of the shotgun. Back to shading, Agrax Earthshade, your friend. It's such a useful wash. And now I'm going to wash the entire figure except for the flesh areas with Agrax Earthshade. As always, make sure your paints are thoroughly dry before you do this. The last thing you want to do is have your paints all blending together when you start putting wash on. And this will put some nice shade in the recesses and unify all that camouflage pattern. If you've got too much on, just use a dry brush to soak up any excess. If there are areas where it's pulled too much, wipe your brush off on a paper towel and just soak up any areas where it's pooled. You don't want heavy deposits of wash on highlight areas, you just want it sitting in the shadows. You can see I'm wiping up some of the excess now. And there he is. Let that dry thoroughly. And then we'll get on to the highlighting stage. So I've still got that light brown on my palette. I'm mixing a bit of a shabty bone with it, which is a good highlight colour if you don't want to use white. Mixing a bit of very light brown, that a shabty bone, is good to get a highlight colour. And then I'm just starting to pick out these armour plate areas, just so they are popping a bit. Just highlighting the straps there at the back. And just the areas where light would hit the top of those armour panels. And this starts to neaten the whole thing, starts to look a lot better. I'm highlighting the edges of the shotgun pouch using a very fine brush and a steady hand. And you can do quite bold highlights here. This is where light is hitting and it makes the figure look three-dimensional and large. And it's just a matter of going around the figure and finding those little edges that you think would catch the light and highlighting them. The edge of the light box there on his shoulder. Just the tips of the edges of the helmet. The edges of the pouches. And again that sort of quilted texture of the shotgun pouch. Stormhost Silver is a good highlight colour for my metal, so I'm just running a line of that across the top of the barrel to highlight the shotgun barrel. Then back with my Shabty Bone Brown mix just to do a little bit more highlighting. I just keep constantly turning the figure around, looking at it from different angles, looking at little spots that need highlighting. It's not a very disciplined approach, I know, I'm not doing it bit by bit, but I just keep working on it until it starts looking really good. Little knee pouches there, the wrinkles, not covering the camouflage pattern, but just highlighting the wrinkles in his pants. Then it's time to highlight the flesh. I've still got my flesh colour on my palette, so I just mix a little bit of white with it to highlight the flesh. And as always, just do that T area and across the cheekbones and then the arms. The front of the hand, fingers. Mix a little bit more white for an even lighter highlight and just highlight the knuckles and the tips of the fingers with a very fine brush. And things like the elbows. Little highlight on the elbows makes it look as if the bone is coming through the skin there where it's bent and pressing against the flesh. Okay, back to the camouflage pattern. I'm just adding a little bit more green, making that pop out a little bit more because it was dulled by the wash. And it's a case of just constantly looking at this camouflage pattern, seeing that it's in balance, seeing which colours are needed, which colours are disappearing. Bit more shabby bone mixed with my brown, so I've got an even lighter highlight. And now I'm doing just the tops of things that would catch the light, sometimes little dots even, or tiny, very tiny strokes, just to give that extra little highlight. I usually find that 2 highlight passes are enough, a general highlight pass and then just a really light one where you just pick out some very, very tiny details just to make it pop a little bit. Just the edge of his camera there, very edges of the helmet. Some little bits on the pouches and straps. This extra highlight really is the finishing touch. It makes a big difference. A few wrinkles in that ammo pouch. And of course highlights on the backs of the heels. Now I've got my yellow colour and I'm just doing that light on his shoulder, just the area where the light is shining. First with some yellow, and then when that's dry, a little dab of white. And we're getting there. Almost finished. I'll just highlight this armband he's got on. Just carefully highlighting the folds of that. And the motion tracker wrist, or his watch on his other wrist. Here's another one. Here's Hicks and Hudson, both done. In the case of Hudson, I went with a more khaki colour for the pouches. And I changed my mind, actually. I thought I was going to go khaki, and I went back to make that a bit brown to match Hicks. So they've both got a similar colour. And of course, that khaki colour for the gun and the motion tracker. And on the motion tracker, I even started painting a little screen on it. Here's Frost, and very similar. Here are the base colours. Same procedure. Then after those base colours, I went on to start painting on the camouflage pattern. There's a bit of white, a bit of green, the general diagonal direction of the camouflage. Then, as before, it's time to give him an overall wash of Agrak's Earthshade. I can also wash his dark skin tone with Agrak's Earthshade, so just that wash all over the figure. And then after that I went on to do the same highlighting passes as the other marine figures. Next up, Vasquez, and she is very similar to a marine, except she has a chest plate, and I'm using Deathworld Forest mixed with a little bit of Dryad bark to give me the kind of dark colour I want for that, a sort of dark khaki olive colour. And then I went on to use the same colours as I used for the other marines. For the gun itself, I used Lead Belcher and made it a bit darker by mixing in some Abaddon Black, so I have a nice dark metallic colour. Add a bit of water to that and paint the gun barrel and the whole supportive mechanism. There she is. Before washing, I've used Mephiston Red for her headband, and I've painted in some of that camouflage effect. And once this is fully dry, I'll be washing the entire figure. First, Seraphim Sepia for the flesh areas, as normal. Agrak's Earthshade for all the rest, except for the gun, which will be Nuln Oil. Once that's dry, I'm using Stormhost Silver, a very light dry brush, just to dry brush the whole gun area. And then using my usual highlight colours, a Shabti Bone mixed with my dark brown mix, I'm highlighting all the detail on her back and on her armour in general, and pants, the whole bit. Same way I did with the Marines. A few dots of white on the headband, of course, and painting in that light on her shoulder as well. And there she is. Vasquez is looking good. Time to move away from the Marines and get on to Newt. I've done the same flesh colour, of course. Now I've got a blue mix, and this is for her overalls. For this I used Thunderhawk blue, and I mixed a bit of white with that to make it a bit lighter. And then I carefully paint that onto all her overalls areas. As you can see, a couple of brushfuls of water so it flows on nicely. Next up, that same dark brown colour I've been using for the marine armour goes onto the helmet, of course. And the helmet will receive the same camouflage treatment that I've used on the Marines. Be careful around the face area when you're painting this in. Don't forget that little communicator coming out from the helmet. And while you've got this dark colour, you can paint in the eyes. XV88 is another light brown colour. I'm using that as the base colour for the hair. It's a nice yellow brown. Now I'm rushing things a little bit here, but you really should let everything else dry before you put this next colour on. After that's all dry, I'm going back to my palette. There's a bit of a shabty bone and dryad bark on there, which I just mixed together to give myself a light brown for her shirt. It's funny when looking at reference for these figures and what they're wearing, because of course the lighting in the actual film changes the colour of things considerably, so I wouldn't worry too much about absolute accuracy. And there she is, so that's all dry. I've used just a dark colour for her shoes. Now I washed the flesh and the hair with Seraphim Sepia. And the shirt as well while I'm here. And then Agrak's Earthshade over the overalls, just to make them look really dirty and grimy. I'll highlight these again later, but this gives a sort of brown shade to the overalls. It makes them look quite grotty. Okay, that's dry, so now I'm going on to the highlighting. Back to my palette, I can mix a little bit of white with my existing overall colour, or overalls colour, and start highlighting in all the wrinkles and folds of the overalls. Adding some Ashabti bone to that brown colour, I'm highlighting a shirt. You can see that all these highlights are relatively bold. I'm not going for subtle blends here. I wanted this to look good from a bit of a distance, from playing distance, so I'm not worried about it being really good close up. Highlighting the hair. I think I used Avaland Sunset just to mix a bit of brighter yellow into that brown. And using a very fine brush, I'm just carefully highlighting the strands of hair. And I've highlighted the flesh, and now just a couple of tiny dots for the eyes, and they're kind of hard to get to there, so they may take a few tries. You can use your dark colour and your dots of eyes just to keep filling with that until it looks right. Then I paint on the camouflage pattern I've used on the other Marines on her helmet. Highlight the flesh of the hands and arm. And then pick out any other highlights I want to do on the helmet area. A little dab of flesh just where her knee or leg shows through that gap in the overalls. Our final figure is Gorman, and he's very easy to paint because he's pretty much wearing the same colour all over except for the pistol he's holding, and that is Baneblade Brown, mixed with a little bit of a Ashabti bone just to lighten it a little bit. And I'll just paint that all over the figure. except for his boots, of course. Nicely polished black boots for Gorman. He does like to look parade ready. And a black to paint that pistol he's holding. Once that's dry, I'm painting the entire figure with Seraphim Sepia. Well, the entire figure except for his boots, that is. As always, remember to wipe off any excess wash that is pooling in the gaps or anywhere you don't want it to be. Now that's dry, I'll mix a Shabti bone again with my original colour and highlight all the clothes areas. And there's lots of strongly delineated wrinkles and folds on his clothes, so they're pretty easy to pick out with a fine brush. I mix a bit of white with my black to highlight the pistol and his boots. And I've used a light blue to pick out those two patches, one on his shoulder and one on his front pocket. And I did a little random design of white and yellow against the blue to make them look like patches with designs on them. Highlight the flesh, a couple of little dots for eyes, and Gorman is done. And you can see at the end of all that, this is how my wet palette looks. I've mixed lots of colours together, and I really recommend you try this technique. Be a little bit more free and easy with your colours. Time for a roll call. Let's look at the figures here and how they've turned out. This one is Hudson holding the motion tracker. Here's Hicks with his shotgun. Frost with flamethrower. Newt. Ripley, of course. Vasquez with smart gun. And Gorman. And the final thing to do is to spray these with some varnish to protect the paint jobs. And as you can see, I've just attached them with a bit of blue tack to a piece of card. And for this I use Tamiya spray varnish. This is TS79. It's a semi-gloss. Some people prefer a matte varnish. I like a little bit of a semi-gloss treatment to it. Makes the colours pop a little bit more. But when I've sprayed those, they'll be protected and completely finished. And remember, I've been doing all this fine detail on these figures, but when you're playing with these figures, you're going to be back up here. This is the kind of distance you're going to see them from. So they're going to look good from a distance. Don't worry too much about perfect paint jobs. They are gaming pieces after all. But I think these look pretty good on the tabletop and really enhance the enjoyment of the game. Well, that's it for painting the marine and civilian figures. Next up, we're going to be painting all the aliens in the core set. Very easy to do. They're all one type of figure. There's 16 of them, but I'll show you a quick technique for painting them all. And after that, we'll get on to the expansions. So stick with me. This is the Esoteric Order of Gamers. I'm Peter, also known as Universal Head, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. Go and check out my website at orderofgamers.com. I'm creating a rules summary and reference sheet for aliens as we speak, and of course when it's finished it'll be up on that website. I've also got a Patreon channel. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's Instagram, all those other things. Check them out and subscribe to this channel if you enjoy the content. Don't forget to hit all notifications. See you next time.